You and I were talking off mic before we started recording, and it seemed that there is a recent study that came out from Barna, and it piqued our interest. It piqued yours so much you've already written a blog post about it, and then today we're going to kind of hash out bits and pieces of this study that we thought were worth our time and worth our listeners' time. So what was the study about, and what are we going to be looking at today?
Well, over the past several years, if not a couple of decades, Barna has been conducting surveys to determine who in the United States holds what he would define as a Christian worldview and who doesn't. And the most recent study came out last August, and reports have been trickling out into the webosphere. Is that what we call that thing? The cloud sphere, wherever those
you can't
things.
say really ether. It's not into the ether, but it is what's on in front of our eyeballs, and everyone. It's those leaks, right? Like you're going to release something that you want people talking about, but you don't release the whole thing. Little tidbits.
Yep. So those tidbits have been coming out, and they've been interesting for sure. I mean, they do tell us something about what's happening in the context of the United States, and so of course we're interested in that, and particularly we're interested in the intersection of faith and culture, and we've been talking a lot about how culture has impacted us. And how so often we as Christians will begin to imitate culture. And in fact, what we're seeing in this Barna study is that Christianity has been impacted by culture, and at some level is imitating culture. And as a result of that imitation, it has progressively moved away from what Barna defines as a Christian worldview. So now, two related pieces of data I think are important here, because in 2017, Barna identified that 17% of Christians who consider faith important actually held a biblical worldview, and this was 2017. And in 2021, that number has slid to be about 6% of Americans have an identifiable Christian worldview. And so there's an 11-point loss there of percentage points loss of those who will have an identifiable Christian worldview.
That is a not small number. An 11-point swing seems entirely significant. So for our listeners, I mean, wow, that is a huge swing. What does Kinnaman, he's the guy who runs Barna, for those who are listening, what does Kinnaman define then as that identifiable worldview? That so many people now have already jumped ship on what could have been described as an identifiable worldview in those 4 years.
Yeah, I don't know if Kinnaman's the one who's defining this, because this has been a study that, of course, predates his tenure at Barna. But the Barna Research Group in general will define a biblical worldview as believing that there are absolute moral truths that exist, that the Bible is totally accurate in all of the principles it teaches, that Satan is considered to be a real being or force, not merely something that's symbolic, that a person cannot earn their way to heaven by trying to be good or doing good works, that Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth, and God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world who still rules the universe today. So that's Barna's definition of worldview. And they've been, like I said, they've been tracking this statistically since 1995. And so we have a good longitudinal study here of these different beliefs over a course of time. Now, we might contest his definition of worldview. That's not important. And I know as these reports come out, oftentimes people will be critical and ask the question, well, why is he defining worldview in that way? Why do you have to believe in Satan? Or why do you have to believe this or that to be or to not to be a Christian? That for me is not of concern. What's of interest to me is the range of the data and the results of that data over a period of time. And whether or not we agree with his definition of worldview, I don't think is all that important. But certainly we can see within that study that there are ideas that are forming in the American psyche, if you will, that clearly are antithetical to Christianity.
You brought up the idea essentially of who's influencing who. We as Christians want to show up in culture, as we have talked at great lengths about through your book on ecclesiology, self-titled ecclesiology. As we've looked at the Ephesian church, we see this example of this church located in Ephesus and how they grow in Christ, and that their growth in Christ was palpable to the world around them, that there was no confusing, right, who was their Lord and what they were about. And that led to change within the culture. And there were benefits of Christians in that culture that were seen. And thus you would look at that Ephesian church and be able to say, wow, it seems like the Christians there were influencing culture. There were changes that were attributable to Christ's work in them, and through that world, he got the glory. And so now we ask the question again, who is influencing who? And this dwindling of those who would say, yes, as Kahneman or as Barna says, this integrated disciple that has fallen. Slidden was not a word. I'm just going to point that out. It has fallen a great deal. What are some of the factors that you believe, Michael, that have led to this precipitous fall?
It's not so much factors that I believe that have led to this fall, but it's the reality of what we're seeing in our context, in the American context. I think there are multiple factors that correlate to the decline that we see. And again, it's going to go back to the 1990s and then move forward. But the prevalence of multiple religious expressions, for example, in the context of the United States is well documented. We're in an incredibly diverse, religiously diverse country. And that diversity impacts the way in which we perceive others and even the way in which we perceive ourselves. Let me give you
just to jump in. Are you, when you say that we have this great diversity, the pluralism, right, of religions all around this, are you stating that as a neutral fact? Are you stating that as a value statement? This is a bad thing, that there are all these other religious beliefs around us. It's kind of a loaded question, but I just want to make sure that we're using the same terms.
Right. No, I'm thinking of it in this case that this is a neutral thing, but it does have an impact on the way in which we believe. So, for example, let me give you two examples of how this has played out over really the past 2 centuries. In 1896 was the centennial celebration of the World Exposition in Chicago. And at that exposition, Christians were delighted to invite people, religious leaders from different religious backgrounds from all over the world to Chicago to showcase the benefits of Christianity. And once these leaders attended the exposition, they began to converse with one another and realized that there was a tremendous need in the United States because of what they perceived to be rampant immorality, whether it was materialism or whatever it would be. And that was the beginning of deliberate missionary activities of other religions into the United States. Most notable was Swami Vivekananda from India, who introduced yoga in the United States in the late 1800s and going into the early 1900s. And now yoga is prevalent everywhere in the United States. In fact, yoga is practiced in some churches as ways to benefit a person's health and be used for physical exercise and so on. What I find fascinating about that is how rapidly it spread and how really utterly successful it's been in penetrating the American Christian mind. And so many Christians have no problem whatsoever in practicing yoga. But the interesting thing is that, I share this story with Indian Christians, and they look at me just absolutely puzzled. What do you mean American Christians are practicing yoga? Don't they know that that's a part of Hinduism? Are they becoming Hindu? And so in the mind of an Indian, when they see an American practicing yoga, there is potentially the thought of a conversion that's taken place, or at least they're on a proper path so that when they are reincarnated, they could potentially be reincarnated in a Hindu context. And that's interesting, isn't it? How that one religious belief has impacted the entire context of the United States. In fact, it comes out even in Barna's study. 57%, according to Barna, of Americans believe in karma, and which is, of course, one of the core beliefs of Hinduism. So religious pluralism is certainly an issue. Postmodern thinking as well is a part of that too. We live in an age where truth is contested, and all truth is contested, and truth becomes relative to the individual. And so now it's not an ultimate truth that is important, but it's a personal truth that becomes important. And that
but it's the same way, because I want to make sure that we're continue to talk, like when you note that postmodernism has as a thought run rampant, I want to make sure we saying again, is that a neutral statement or is that a value statement? Are we saying the increase in postmodernism is bad, or are you really saying the loss of truth is bad?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is that the increase of a postmodern worldview or deconstructionist worldview correlates with the declines that we're seeing in this Barna study. And so, for example, if a deconstructionist or postmodern worldview would hold to the idea that truth is subjective, then it doesn't surprise us, for example, when Barna says that 52% of those who self-identify as Christians believe that the Bible is accurate and reliable as the Word of God. Only 52%. In other words, 48% don't believe that it's accurate or reliable, or they're on some continuum of not believing it. 60% of born-again Christians believe the Bible is accurate or reliable. 58% of evangelicals, 74% of those who are born again. And so, and then you follow that up with this other topic of moral truth. According to Barna, at least as the question was asked, that determining moral truth is up to each individual. there are no moral absolutes that apply to everyone all the time. And so 52% of Christians would have agreed with that statement. 65% of those who identify themselves as born again agree with that statement, that there are no moral absolutes that apply to everyone. 65% of evangelicals and 40% of those who identify themselves as being born again agree with that idea that there is no moral absolutes that apply to everyone. And so we're seeing a significant portion of the American population. It has been impacted by what we might refer to as a postmodern worldview.
I have two thoughts. One, I just want to make sure we ask because let's just say the college that I went to, that you may be familiar with, in that day and age, postmodernism was used like a swear word, right? Like if you had any bits of postmodernism in your thinking or in your communication, you were anathema. Like, how, oh no, it's spread to you as well. Postmodernism is rampant. We have to eradicate postmodernism, and postmodernism becomes the boogeyman that everybody in somewhat traditional Christianity is chasing after, trying to root out. And there are also some people who are just like, well, postmodernism also developed to say, hey, modernism had some things wrong. Like some of the things that existed in that modernist way of thinking should have been questioned and called to task. And then some of those things, that's why I redirect it and say, is it postmodernism or is it the loss of truth, moral truth, absolute truth? Because certainly these figures seem to show the loss of truth and absolute truth is the thing that is so far afield from historical, traditional Christianity. And I'm not trying to do a tease, but we will be recording a podcast shortly talking about what things fall under that historical, traditional, the things that the church has believed with everyone for all time, everywhere. I can't wait to record that, but it does seem that when you look at a study like this, and you look at Barna's questions, when you hold those questions up to the people around you, they seem, it's like, oh, that, I mean, yeah, sure. No moral absolutes. There's some gray, but then you hold it up against what the church has historically believed for all time everywhere. And it's like, okay, this is very, very different. The way that the Bible talks about these things, the way that the church has believed for all time, these sort of statements, Christians saying like, oh yeah, there's tons of gray, we can't be sure. I mean, that's great cause for alarm. It's great cause for alarm because it is the erosion of a lot of the things that we have actually built our faith on. And so if there are people who are saying these sort of things aren't true anymore, that we can't know or have that absolute knowledge, the epistemology of it all is kind of like, so then what is your faith? Like, how do you believe what you believe or say you believe what you believe? Because you are actually disagreeing with yourself in some way, shape, and form. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we want to, be careful, of course, when we're talking about these things and understand that truth is truth. And
whether you like it or not,
whether you like it or not. And the relativity of truth, I suppose, is what's at issue here. Mm-hmm. And postmodernism, as you, I think, rightly said, there are some benefits to it as it's critiquing modernism. I mean, there are issues with terms anyway. I mean, for example, Thomas Oden, when he talks about postmodernism, he talks about it very differently than what we might read in Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida.
For those of us who are not as cool, how does Oden talk about it and how does Derrida talk about it, that you are contrasting the two?
Yeah, well, postmodernism, according to Oden, is a revitalizing of the ancient in the modern. He follows the line of thinking in architecture, where postmodern architecture is revitalizing the good things of the past and making them relevant in our time today. Mm-hmm. And so you see that even in the city where you are, Andrew. One of my favorite buildings is the what used to be called the Republic Bank building. I don't know what it's called now down there, but that's an example of postmodern architecture. For Foucault and Derrida and others, the postmodernism is thought more along the lines of deconstructionism, where you're deconstructing what it was that you once believed in a critical way, and even going as far as to say that in the reconstruction potentially of it, that it depends on who you are. In hermeneutics, for example, this is where we get reader response from this kind of deconstruction idea that now it's how I react to a text, for example, that makes it true or not true. It's not true in and of itself or not true in and of itself. It's how I now interpret it. Because I am the one who is impacting the text, and the text is impacting me. So in some way, then I am the interpreter of that text, whether right or wrong. And so we can see then the dangers in some cases of a reader response, deconstructionist hermeneutic that relativizes truth altogether. And, of course, the interesting thing about all of this is that in the midst of these competing views of interpretation, that people will be very dogmatic about them. Well, yes, of course, we have to use a reader response hermeneutic. And then you sit back and you wonder, how can they be so dogmatic and believe this so strongly when they don't actually believe that there is an absolute truth? How can they be so absolutely certain that this is the way in which you interpret? And so there are, those kinds of philosophical problems with these various issues. And those creep into, our day and age. The past couple of years have certainly shown us that people hold very different views about so many different things, and we have been, I suppose, in some way, paying the price for how relative that we have held things that might have been thought of in terms of truth before.